On this, recognized for any questions he cares to ask. Oh, I'm sorry. No, you did not lose your place. I apologize. Distinguished ranking member, or vice chairman of the full committee.
Whatever.
Whatever. Burgess, you're recognized.
It's been a long day already, and I I don't want to prolong things too much. Mr. Chairman, I will say I'm a little bit concerned that we don't have a witness here to speak to the energy provisions in the bill in front of us. Of course, limit, save, and grow, as one of its central tenets was you had to grow the economy. You had to have economic growth in order to get out of some of the problems that we are facing as a country with our debt load. And part of the Limit, Save, and Grow Act was H.R. 2, which had come through the Energy and Commerce Committee, the Committee on Natural Resources, and had been very carefully constructed, and particularly the permitting reform that was that was placed into H.R. 1 was so critically important that if we don't have the permitting reform, we are not going to be able to produce the energy that will allow us to have the economic growth that we all know is necessary to get us out of the current debt crisis. Now, there is some language that is similar, different but similar, that is in the current legislation before us. Had we a witness who could speak to the energy provisions in this bill, I would have liked to ask why we see the language that we see in front of us rather than the language that was in the Limit, Save, and Grow Act. Limit, Save, and Grow Act identified a lead agency that would be responsible for shepherding projects through the NEPA process. In the bill in front of us, we have that the various agencies will get together and designate a lead agency rather than having one designated in the legislation. Distinction and want of a difference, maybe, but on the other hand, it gives broad authority to the agency to be able to not perform the way I think we should have instructed them to perform. And I don't like to admit this, but I was watching Morning Joe last week, and they had a little segment on the 140-year anniversary of the opening of the Brooklyn Bridge. Truly a marvel of engineering, and you think at the time, 140 years ago, to be able, nothing like that had existed before, and to imagine that and engineer that and build that. And oh, by the way, Washington Roebling, who was the original engineer, unfortunately died of tetanus during the construction of the bridge, and his son was tasked with finishing it. But Ken Burns was on the program, and they sort of asked the question wistfully, why are we not able to do big things like that anymore? And I'm sure the tenor and tone of the people who were talking about it was surely to believe that, well, it's Republicans who are probably keeping us from doing stuff like this. But look at the regulatory world that people have to deal with today compared to back then. And while regulations, and we talked about it in the Rules Committee when the H.R. 2 came in front of the Rules Committee, some of the regulations appropriate and important, but the problem is you slow everything down, you bring the cost up to where perhaps a project is no longer feasible, and then couple that with the fact that you're putting massive federal subsidies into competing types of projects. And is it any wonder that we don't get big things done anymore? And I would have just suggest that the language that was in Limit, Save, and Grow, particularly along the lines of the permitting reform in designating a lead agency. Yes, this legislation does have a lead agency, but it has to be agreed to by other agencies. And again, to me, that's just a recipe for nothing getting done. There is a shot clock. There was one in Limit, Save, and Grow. There's a shot clock in this legislation. There was some liability protection in limit, save, and grow. It exists in this as well, but all of it is a little less precise than the language we had in the previous bill. And the only reason I bring this up is because the Energy and Commerce Committee, Committee on Natural Resources, and we had the hearing on that, Mr. Chairman. We had representatives from those committees here to talk to us about that. And if you'll recall, that hearing went on for quite some time, and there were a lot of questions. So tip of the hat to Mr. Massey, he's right. These things should never be decided by one person in a room. We went through regular order in the Energy and Commerce Committee. We took a lot of testimony on this. We had a lot of hearings on permitting reform, and we came up with what I thought was pretty tight language on the permitting reform side. I hope what we've got here in front of us is going to turn out to be just as good. I know I've heard from a number of people in industry today who feel pretty good about the language that is in this bill. But I'm sorry, it's not the same thing, and it gets to the problem Mr. Massey spoke to. You just can't possibly know everything there is to know about everything, which is why you don't do things with one or two or three people in a room. Four corners is something that always makes my blood run cold when I hear this is a four corners agreement. No, we are the people's representatives in the people's house. It is up to us to do the hearings, take the testimony, write the legislation, fight the battles in committee, bring it to the Rules Committee, and then take it to the floor.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, I'd be happy to yield.
I think another remarkable thing that's happened here with this rule is 72 hours to read this bill. I've been here almost 11 years. You almost never get 72 hours to read a bill like this. And my opinion of it has evolved over the 48 hours that have passed or so. And I think that's really important aspect of this, since you can't know everything about
Yeah,
everything.
reclaiming my time, you got to be careful, because now Mr. McGovern is going to claim credit for the McGovern rule.
Yes,
And we do not want.
I
we
do want
not
to take
want
credit for
give-
that.
We do not want to
Wait,
give them.
but we should take credit for implementing it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we did more than you ever did. But anyway, but it's the McGovern rule. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to actually amend.
Gentleman from Texas controls the time.
I'm going to ask to amend the bill to make it now the Massey rule, but, and Mr. Massey is quite correct. We've never had that ability to say, you got to do the appropriations. If you don't do them on time, you get an automatic CR, and guess what? It's less money than what you would have had you been able to do your appropriations on time. That is a failing of this House, and yes, Mr. Massey, I was here when we used to do appropriations under open rules and come to the floor with a big chief tablet and a crayon, and you could scribble out an amendment and have it heard on the floor, get to talk about it for 5 minutes before you had it voted down. But that was that was a way of allowing the people's representatives to actually participate in the process. Now, look, I will say there's things in this that I do like. I do like, as Mr. Massey pointed out, we get that hard stop on the appropriations process, and we know that September 30th is a real date that has to be met. Too many times we have allowed ourselves to skate past it, both parties, say the dog ate my homework, and we gave ourselves an IOU till some point after an election somewhere. That's never a good way to govern, and we ought to be much more precise in how we spend the people's money. Again, there's some parts of this that I'm still going through and still trying to understand, but at the same time, I think it would have been a better product had we at least allowed the original language on the permitting side to stay in place, rather than adding things at the end that I don't want to say they're superfluous. I know they're important to some people, but it wasn't what we had worked on through the committee. It wasn't what we had taken testimony on. It wasn't what we had voted on in committee. But thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, I apologize for being late today. Through the miracle of the C-SPAN app, I was able to hear all of Mr. Negusa's dissertation when he had the floor. So thank you, and I'll yield back.
Thank you very much. Now,
Wait, I should say, if any member of the panel wishes to comment on the energy provisions, I'm happy to hear what you have to say.
Without commenting on particular provisions, I think there's a lot of issues regarding permitting that we talk about. But one of the things I just wanted to highlight as we look at from an economic growth standpoint, I mean, we see so many things, a lot of federal investment that's being made, and if you can't get those projects implemented, you don't have the American jobs, and therefore you don't have the tax revenue, which will solve some of our problem with our deficit. So it's good to have some of those provisions, and we just, as you said, this bill has, it started off with some particular provisions in limit, save, grow, and it's not as good in a lot of areas that we would have liked it to be.
Well, without a robust energy sector, it is hard for even someone as capable as the American farmer, it is hard for them to overcome all the obstacles that we put in their way. And as the famous Charlie Daniels song says, if the man don't work, the people don't eat. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
thank you very much. Gentleman from South Carolina is now recognized for
I
any
won't
questions.
belabor the point. We've been here a long time. Let me just say,